You have spent your entire life solving problems that were never yours to solve alone. Not because you were asked to, not because you volunteered, but because somewhere between childhood and adulthood, the asking reflex simply never fully developed the way it was supposed to. Someone around you needed something, and you handled it. Something in your own life broke, and you fixed it quietly, without telling anyone it was broken in the first place. You got through things that should have required a support system, using nothing but the wiring inside your own head, and you called that normal, because for you, it always has been. The strange part is you are not even sure when it started. It does not feel like a coping mechanism, it does not feel like damage, it just feels like you. Here's what nobody has bothered to explain. The reason you never ask for help has almost nothing to do with pride and everything to do with a very specific psychological adaptation that got installed in you before you were old enough to choose it. You came to age inside an emotional climate that no other generation before or after you fully inhabited. The generation ahead of you didn't ask for help because the culture told them explicitly that needing things made you weak and that real people endured in silence. The generation behind you asks for help openly, publicly, frequently, and has built entire identities around their needs and their healing and their struggles. You landed exactly between both of those worlds and belonged fully to neither. You were the first generation raised in significant numbers by parents who were physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely. The first generation to come home to an empty house after school and figure out dinner, figure out the afternoon, figure out the feelings sitting in your chest with no adult available to name it for you. The first generation handed independence not as something earned or celebrated, but as a quiet default setting, because the adults around you were absorbed in their own survival and assumed you were fine because you looked fine, and you looked fine because you had already learned that looking fine was the safest available option. That was not neglect in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and in some ways more lasting. It was the slow accumulation of moments where you reached for support and found either absence or a version of presence that had no room for your need on that particular day. And each one of those moments laid down a thin layer of wiring that over time became a complete operating system, an entire internal architecture built around one foundational premise. The most reliable version of support is the support you generate yourself. Start with the specific moment that built the pattern, not the dramatic version, the ordinary version that left the deeper mark. You were somewhere between 8 and 12 years old. Something was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just the ordinary wrong of being a child in a situation that felt larger than your capacity to manage it alone. And you looked around for the adult who was supposed to help carry it with you. And either they were not there at all, or they were physically present, but you could read with the precise emotional intelligence of a child who has learned to read rooms carefully that they had nothing available. Their stress was on the surface. Their exhaustion was visible. Their own unprocessed weight was already taking up all the available space. And before you could even form the words of what you needed, your system made a calculation so fast it did not feel like a decision. It felt like gravity. You took the thing that was wrong and you folded it inward. You compressed it. You carried it. And you walked back into the room looking completely fine because nothing appeared wrong. And nothing appeared wrong because you had already decided at a cellular level that your need was not something the room could hold. Psychologists have a precise name for the pattern that moment created. It is called dismissing attachment. It is one of 4 primary attachment orientations that researchers have mapped through decades of studying how human beings relate to need, support, and dependency across the entire lifespan. The dismissing attachment pattern develops specifically in environments where emotional needs were consistently unmet, not through cruelty or abuse, but through chronic unavailability. The child in that environment learns through pure repetition, not as a conscious choice, but as survival wiring, that needs are safer managed internally than externally, that asking creates more disruption than resolution, that self-sufficiency is not just a preference, but a form of protection. That the version of you least likely to be disappointed, least likely to be a burden, least likely to feel the specific humiliation of needing something and not receiving it, is the version of you that has already handled everything before anyone knew there was anything to handle. That wiring is still running right now in the way your body responds to an offer of assistance with an automatic deflection that happens before your conscious brain has even processed whether you actually want the help, in the way you feel a quiet internal friction when someone tries to assist you with something you had already mentally assigned to yourself, in the way that making a direct request of another person, even a completely reasonable request from someone who genuinely wants to give what you need, produces a faint but real internal resistance that has always been present and has never quite had an explanation that felt accurate until this moment. Here's the piece that most people miss entirely. That wiring was not an error. Inside the environment it was built for, it was a genuinely intelligent response. A child who could not reliably access external support and learn to build internal support from scratch was doing something that in those specific conditions was exactly correct. The system worked. It kept you functional. It kept you moving. It kept you from accumulating the particular kind of damage that comes from asking repeatedly into a space that cannot answer. The problem is not that the wiring exists. The problem is that the wiring never received an update. The original conditions changed. The adults around you grew up or left or changed. Your life over decades filled with people who are actually present, actually capable, actually willing to show up for you in ways the original environment never modeled as possible. But the system kept running the original program because no one ever sent the signal that the emergency was over. The protocol that kept you safe at 9 years old is still governing how you move through the world at 53, and it has never once been asked to justify its continued operation. Now go one layer deeper, because this is where the pattern becomes specific to your generation in a way that makes it impossible to miss once you see it clearly. Gen X did not just grow up with emotionally unavailable adults. Gen X grew up watching those adults perform a very specific kind of certainty they didn't actually have. You watched people pretend to have answers they were making up in real time, pretend to be fine when everything in the private reality behind the public face told a completely different story. Put the composed expression forward for the world and let the actual reality leak out sideways in ways that confused you and unsettled you as a child, even when you didn't have the vocabulary to name what you were observing. You absorbed a lesson from watching that performance that went deeper than words. The lesson was that showing your need exposes something that should stay hidden, that visible need makes you either a target or a burden, and sometimes both simultaneously. That the people who are respected and stable and trustworthy are the people who appear not to need anything from anyone ever. You built your entire social identity on that lesson. You became the person other people come to, the one who gives the advice, the one who holds the structure steady when everyone else is losing their grip on it, the one who knows what to do and does it without making it someone else's problem first. Not because you are cold, not because you are incapable of need, but because buried inside your operating system is a rule so old and so foundational that it has never been examined directly, and it says the acceptable version of yourself is the self-sufficient version, the version that handles things, the version that is fine. The research on this pattern specifically within Gen X is striking in its consistency. Studies across this generation show significantly elevated rates of what behavioral scientists formally call compulsive self-reliance, a pattern in which the refusal to seek help persists and actually intensifies even in situations where help is clearly available, clearly needed, and would clearly and measurably improve the outcome. The data also surfaces something that sits underneath the self-reliance and makes it heavier. Gen X reports among the highest levels of what researchers have labeled hidden distress, the sustained experience of functioning normally and competently on the outside, while carrying a significant and largely unprocessed internal weight that has never been named out loud to another person. You have been carrying something for a long time, possibly for most of your adult life. And the carrying has felt so ordinary for so long that you may have genuinely stopped registering it as weight. The practical cost of this compounds quietly across every domain of your life, in ways that are easy to overlook because none of them announce themselves dramatically. Relationships where you were consistently available, consistently present, consistently generous with your attention and your capacity and your time, but where no one, not even the people closest to you, has ever seen you genuinely need something and ask for it directly. Professional situations where you absorbed more than your fair share of a problem, more than your fair share of a burden, because requesting resources or support felt indistinguishable from admitting that you were not enough on your own. Health situations where you waited significantly longer than you should have, because the act of going to another person about something happening inside your own body felt like an imposition you had not yet earned the right to make. Financial situations where you navigated alone through decisions that a single honest conversation with someone who had relevant knowledge could have permanently altered. Where you solved with enormous personal energy what a 20-minute phone call might have resolved completely. Here is what the behavioral data shows about what actually happens when people who carry this pattern begin to practice asking deliberately and consciously. Not dramatic shifts, small ones, precise ones, applied in low-pressure contexts. The research across multiple independent studies points to the same result. The act of asking, even in small situations where the stakes are minimal, begins to generate new data for a system that has been operating on data that is 30 or 40 years old. The request was made. Nothing collapsed. The person asking is still standing. The relationship did not deteriorate. In a measurable number of cases, the relationship moved demonstrably closer. The system receives this data and begins, slowly, with real resistance, because old wiring does not update quickly or willingly, to revise the model it has been running without interruptions since childhood. The single most actionable thing you can take from this and apply this week is something researchers call strategic vulnerability. It is not a dramatic gesture. It is not an emotional announcement. It is not therapy homework or vulnerability performance for social points. It is choosing one situation this week, one specific, low-stakes, ordinary situation where you would normally solve something entirely alone, and instead making one specific request of one specific person. Not because you cannot handle it by yourself. You absolutely can. You always could. That capacity is not in question, and it is not going anywhere. The mechanism that exists to update wiring that was built in a completely different world, under completely different conditions, is new behavioral evidence that the old prediction was wrong. One ask, one moment of the system receiving information that contradicts the original program. That is how the update begins. You came into this video as someone who handles things, someone who has always handled things. That is not a flaw to be corrected, and it is not going anywhere. The capacity for self-reliance that got built into you in those early rooms is genuinely valuable and genuinely yours, and it has served you in ways that are real and worth keeping. But there is a version of that same person who has also learned, slowly, deliberately, against 30 years of very old wiring, that asking is not the same as collapsing, that needing something from another person is not the same as being a burden, that the people in your life who are actually present, actually available, actually capable of showing up for you, they are not an imposition you would be making. They are a resource you have been leaving completely unused for 30 decades while you carried everything alone in the dark and told anyone who noticed that you were fine. You do not have to call it fine anymore. If this reached something real in you, share it with someone in your life who carries everything alone and has never had the language to explain why. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into what makes this generation's psychology so specific, so consistently overlooked, and so worth finally understanding in full. There is considerably more to cover.